Hi, it's Nick from the Run Testers, and this is our review of the Polar Pacer Pro. So the Polar Pacer Pro is one of two new watches that Polar launched lately. It's part of its Pacer range. These basically don't bring a lot of new features to the table compared to existing Polar watches, but bring a lot of the key features from Polar's top-end devices like the Vantage V2 and GritX Pro into kind of lighter, cheaper, smaller watches. The Pacer Pro costs £259 in the UK or $299.90 in the US, and the cheaper Pacer is £169.50 in the UK. These watches essentially kill off the Polar Vantage M2, which is the same price as the Polar Pacer Pro, but offers less features than even the Pacer and has a less nice design. So I guess that watch is kind of on its way out. Pacer Pro is aimed at runners, but it's a full multi-sport watch, and it has a nice sleek, light design, which weighs just 41 grams, including the band. It's got an aluminium bezel, which is a key upgrade compared to the Pacer, which is an all-plastic design, and it has a new, brighter screen compared to Polar's past models. Oh, this is still a memory and pixel reflective color display rather than something like an AMOLED screen or anything like that. Battery life is listed as 35 hours of GPS or 7 days of general use, and you can extend it up to 100 hours with power-saving training modes. The watch is waterproof to 50 meters, has a barometric altimeter, which is a notable upgrade on the M2, and it isn't on the cheaper Pacer watch. And it also has an improved version of Polar's Precision Prime optical heart rate sensor. Got a couple more LEDs in there to improve accuracy, and there's no bumps, so it should sit nice and snugly against the wrist. Polar also promised better GPS accuracy thanks to kind of reconfigured antenna, but this is not like an all systems GPS or dual band GPS that you're starting to see on more expensive watches. So some of the key features that you've got here that have dropped down from the pricier watches are things like breadcrumb navigation with turn-by-turn directions, a hill splitter, running and cycling fitness test, and also there's a new walking test where you walk for 15 minutes at a brisk pace and get a VO2 max reading, and there's also Strava live segments on the watch. Some limited smart features have rolled down too. You've got notification support, weather forecasts, and music controls, so you can control playback on your phone, but there's no music storage here. And then you're getting, all the kind of classic Polar features, you're getting really detailed training analysis, great sleep tracking, suggested workouts based on your recovery each night, and then FuelWise, kind of Polar's fueling and hydration helper, which will kind of help you plan out those things for long training sessions and races. Still a few things that aren't on the Pacer Pro that are on the more expensive watches, like Polar's orthostatic tests and the kind of outdoor dashboard that shows things like a compass. But in general, you're also paying for an upgrade in design because those watches have touchscreens, nicer materials you use, they're a bit bigger, a bit chunkier. I will say the loss of a touchscreen isn't massive because they're very laggy on the pricey watches. But yeah, that's the reasons you might still want to upgrade. And then in terms of what the Pacer Pro has that the Pacer doesn't, like I say, you've got an all plastic design on the cheaper watch. You don't get running power on that watch or navigation. And also there's no hill splitter because there's no barometric altimeter in the cheaper watch.
So design for me then, well, what you're getting here, I think is kind of pretty classic Polar. I think the looks are quite simple, quite sort of stylish. It's nice and light and comfortable on the wrist. I don't mind the overall frame. It's a little bit cheaper. It's not the kind of premium materials that you might find on the Vantage V2 and some of those other sort of more premium Polar watches, but it looks like a Polar watch. It kind of feels like a Polar watch on the wrist. The bands are comfortable enough. All of that kind of stuff is fine by me, actually. I've enjoyed kind of wearing this. I can wear it overnight, no problem. The only thing I will say is that, the screen, obviously they've sort of said it's been upgraded to make it slightly more bright, but, I still don't think it's the brightest going. It's perfectly legible, but it's just not the top performer. The other thing, you've got that kind of big bezel that's still there on the screen, which kind of reduces the overall real estate for the stat. And yeah, it just makes it feel a little bit kind of old school. We sort of now are starting to see kind of edge-to-edge displays or a little bit more kind of real estate. So that's one thing that's not going to be great for people. I don't miss the fact there's no touch screen. I'm very happy using the buttons. They're nice and responsive. I find the Polar controls pretty good. I find the UI just as easy to understand and use as a Garmin, so no problems there. The other bugbear that I have got though is that Polar's changed the charging cable again. Now Garmin has got to a situation where they've got one charging type and they use it across all their watches. And then you can use old cables to go through the new watches, which is fantastic. It just means that you end up with more cables. So if you're traveling, you can leave one at home, you can have one in your bag, you can do all of that. Polar keeps changing the cables. They'd sort of got this round base solution with a lot of their other watches, which I thought was fine. but they've changed that now and you've got another different cable, so that's a little bit annoying.
So design-wise, the Polar Pacer Pro pretty much ticks the key boxes for me in terms of what I look for in a running watch. It's nice and light, it's slim, the screen is kind of offering good enough visibility, I think, outdoors and indoors as well. Essentially, you're getting a Polar Vantage V2, but something that's smaller, lighter, and thinner. It's not the most exciting looking watch, but in terms of being comfortable to wear 24/7, it has been. You've got a strap that you can change, and you can put unofficial 20mm straps on here as well, which I think is quite nice. You've got to use this adapter that Polar kind of provides. Now, for me, the screen, I wish there was more screen. There's more, there's a big black bezel around that screen. I think it's something we've all mentioned in our testing. It's common across all of kind of Polar's top end watches at the moment. I just wish there was more screen there to kind of let your data spread out a bit more. But the screen has been fine to actually view. I just wish there was a bit more of it.
Design for me is pretty familiar. It's a kind of classic Polar look, but in a kind of sleeker, lighter design. It looks like a stripped back Vantage V2 in a way. Screen is a little bit more readable. I'd say after a few weeks of using the watch, it's kind of notable that it is pretty clear in all conditions. It is still a shame that there's still that massive black ring around the screen. It just does make the watch look a bit outdated for me, I think. In terms of kind of looks and interacting with it and the general user experience, it still isn't up to the standards of Garmin watches or even Coros watches. It's just not that fun to interact with all the time. But, it's not a bad looking watch. It just, like I say, it looks a little bit outdated for me. Polar did kind of flag up a GPS improvement due to the repositioned antennae on the Pacer Pro, but I haven't noticed anything like that in kind of a few weeks of running. Generally, I've had it up against the Garmin Epix 2 in multi-band GPS mode, which is very accurate, I have found, throughout my use of it. And the Polar tends to come a little bit short on the run, and there's nothing too dramatic, but you are seeing, you're kind of on GPS tracks, you'll see the Pacer Pro will have you on the wrong side of the road more, a few more wobbles, the odd cut corner. Nothing that's too much of a problem really. The GPS is pretty solid. If you're using it to pace hard runs, occasionally it will just throw up a really bad reading and wreck them a little bit, I found, especially if running on little loops. But broadly speaking, the GPS is pretty solid and in line with what you get from most sports watches. It's just that we are starting to see watches that can use all GPS satellite systems at once or dual band GPS, and they're starting to improve things a little bit, whereas there's nothing like that really here on the Pacer Pro. You can use two GPS systems at once, but it's nothing that amazing on the GPS front and nothing too disastrous either.
So GPS performance was pretty good for me. It's not the best that I have used, but I think it's kind of up there with the kind of best, and it's very similar to the experience I got from the Vantage V2, the Grit X Pro, the Vantage M2. It felt very similar in terms of performance. You're mainly comparing it to the Garmin Epix 2, and that's probably the most accurate GPS watch I've used recently, and it kind of wasn't far off of that in terms of tracking. And core stats like average pace, those are the kind of things that I look for, were generally in the kind of same ballpark as well. So from a GPS performance, I thought it was pretty solid overall. Not the most accurate I've used recently, but in terms of what else Polar has kind of offered from their top end watches, the Pacer Pro feels very similar in terms of performance.
GPS performance for me, I think, was pretty solid actually. It gets uplink really quickly, which I really like. Compared to my Garmin Enduro, every time this Polar Pacer Pro was kind of on the money, bang, like in less than 10 seconds I was sort of ready to run, whereas the Enduro sort of laboured a bit, so it was really good for that. In terms of distance kind of accuracy, I found it within the kind of 10% margin for error that you get with these things. So, there are a lot of factors that affect whether or not your distances will come in the same. You can wear the same watch on two different wrists, the same model, and come back with different readings from the same run because of the way the infrastructure works. So, I found that absolutely fine. Real-time pace was okay as well. It was fairly responsive for me. I have no real problems with that at all.
So in terms of heart rate performance, again, very similar story to what I found with the Vantage V2 and the Grit X Pro. For kind of steady pace runs, it felt generally fine. When I ran against a Wahoo Ticker chest strap, the data kind of pretty much matched up in general in terms of average and max readings. When I did some high intensity kind of interval sessions, kind of track sessions, I always got a higher max readings. It was almost kind of 5 to 10 BPM over the chest strap. So again, you can pair a heart rate monitor to this external heart rate monitor. That's what I would do if you are very much focused on your kind of heart rate based training. Also, it fuels a lot of the features, training features and analysis features you get on the Polar Watch as well, which is, there's a lot there. So definitely if you're looking at heart rate, you want more accurate heart rate. Particularly for running, I would grab a chest strap to get the kind of most reliable data and insights.
Heart rate performance then, And there is an upgraded kind of optical heart rate sensor in the back of this, but I think, it's optical heart rate. I feel like the performance was pretty standard fare that you'll get across kind of optical heart rate watches, particularly kind of polar watches. I put it up against the Garmin Enduro's optical sensor. It kind of matched that pretty so much kind of beat for beat. Did the same kind of things where you get, sometimes it lags, sometimes it spikes. There are some kind of strange readings sometimes at the beginning of runs. All of those things are still present, but that is, for me, just basically optical heart rate sensing. We say it in every video. If you really care about it that much, and particularly if you want to make the most out of the really kind of good recovery information and all of those kind of training load insights that come with polar watches, you've got to put on a chest strap to get the most of it. So yeah, I thought standard optical heart rate performance here.
Heart rate has been the usual story, I'd say, with any sports watch. That the Pacer Pro's got this improved heart rate monitor, and it's probably been a little bit better for me than other polar watches, but still nothing special. Like, it will log pretty well for most of the time. Day-to-day runs, especially steady or easy runs, it has a pretty good reading. But, if you're doing intervals, it will lag behind them. And occasionally during hard runs, I did find that it would just read way too low for like long spells and really wreck the kind of training status analysis you're going to get from the watch as a result. I did a 5K race with this watch, and I could see heart rate was steadily increasing pretty well, pretty accurately. And then around kind of 3-4K, it just dived and dropped off for a long period. And, obviously that didn't happen. I was dying at the end of a 5K. So yeah, I think if you're going to use the heart rate for either judging training or using the training analysis, then you're going to want a chest strap just to make sure you're getting the most accurate results. I've been charging the Pacer Pro around every kind of 5 days. It does tend to drop off about 20% a day for me. I'm running every day, but really the running isn't what really drains the battery life on the Pacer Pro, I'd say. Like, it's just polar watches just use a lot more battery, throughout the day and night. I think it's partly because they're offering a bit more than other sports watches when it comes to sleep tracking, but you are going to have to charge this fairly regularly. In terms of the GPS battery life, I think you will get kind of 30 to 35 hours out of this watch on a single run, but obviously you'll have to have it fully charged when you start, and it's really the drop off between runs that means the Pacer Pro is less impressive on the battery front than what you get from Coros and Garmin's, which do drain much more slowly when you're not training.
Battery performance for me, I think on a week's training, kind of we're talking about sort of 7 or 8 hours training, a couple of hour runs, and then obviously got your 2 hour longer runs on the Sunday. That was basically what it covered for me. I found I had to charge this kind of every sort of 5 to 6 days, probably max. It's still fairly frequent, but that's, again, you're sort of talking about kind of standard for a watch. A single hour's kind of GPS runtime was about 5% battery cost. So, that's again, it's kind of okay. There are things that I did have a problem with though. One thing is when at the start of a race, it gets down to 5% battery on this. You can't start a GPS tracked run. It won't let you. And, so you're actually, the overall capacity of the battery is the sort of 95%. That doesn't happen with other watches. Particularly if 5% should cover you for a quick 5K, which is exactly how I was going to use it. I know Mike had some problems with that as well. And that just is a little bit of an irritation, which you don't get with some of the Garmin watches. The other thing to say is, like other polar watches we've mentioned on the channel, the overnight battery drain really is what kind of causes some of the major problems. That's really reducing that overall kind of single charge battery duration. I was finding around kind of 10% drain overnight because Polar is using it for, there's a lot of features running here with your sleep and your recovery and all of that stuff that's going on. You can't switch a lot of that off, so you're kind of stuck with it. So you can't really make smarter decisions about kind of how you use that battery life and how you eke out longer battery life, which I think would be good if you could.
So in terms of battery life, it kind of breaks down to a couple of things here really. Polar is offering the same up to 7 days battery life as the Vantage V2 and the Grit X. You're getting 35 hours of GPS battery life, which is 5 hours less than the Vantage V2. And that's more than what you'll get from something like the Garmin 40245, which is kind of in this price range as well. So it does offer more GPS battery life. The problem is that I would probably get 5 to 6 days, maybe max. And the problem is that you've got one feature in particular that is really drain the battery, which I wouldn't expect to drain the battery. So the sleep tracking and the nightly recharge measurements is definitely showing a noticeable drain kind of overnight, similar to what I've experienced on other Polar watches. In terms of GPS tracking, I think an hour's worth of running, the battery drop off was 3 to 5%, which is what I would expect to see anyway. And you do have a kind of a training mode, which obviously 100 hours where it turns off the heart rate and the interval measurements between the GPS becomes longer, obviously, so the accuracy kind of drops off a little bit. But for me, generally you're getting 5 to 6 days based on my testing, not quite the 7 days. It's just a shame you can't disable those kind of sleep tracking features to get a little bit longer from this watch.
So those other features, the navigation on the watch is pretty good. It's not maps, but you only get those on very expensive watches, and turn by turn with breadcrumb trails is, more than good enough, to navigate through pretty much any run. And you also get the back to start pointer. You don't get track back navigation, which you do get on more expensive polar watches that will guide you all the way home along the route you came. But a pointer is good enough. You can go and get lost on a run and you'll be pointed back in the general direction of where you started.
I think Komoot and the turn by turn navigation on this is really kind of practical, easy to use. I love Komoot as a tool. I find it brilliant for kind of making and mapping. I've actually just mapped my entire route along the Danube for the Danube run that I'm going to do this summer on Komoot. Transferring those routes to the watch is nice and easy. Following them turn by turn on the wrist, I found really kind of nice and easy. It gave me flags in time before the turns came. So all of that I thought was a really good feature, and I do like that about Polar's watches currently.
The training analysis is really good. I think Polar does a great job of balancing, having a lot of depth and kind of stats available to those who want it in the app and on the website, and then providing a quick snapshot kind of rating on the wrist, which is what I tend to use. Like, I'll just check in occasionally on the wrist and see if I'm productive or overreaching, and then if there is something concerning, I might dive into the more detailed stats. I will say, if you've used Polar watches in the past, sometimes it takes a while for the reading for the training status on the watch and the one in the app and the website to all tally together, but that does happen after a few weeks. I also really like the watch face on the watch that shows that breaks down your training by heart rate zones and time over the course of a week. I just wish that it didn't take into account all training, so I just want my running on that watch face. I'd like to be able to turn off things like yoga, cycling and that kind of stuff, because they're all very easy, so it skews my week a little bit to really make it look like I've done no hard work at all. Structured workouts on Polar I just don't think are done very well. It's a constant complaint of mine. They're really keen for you to use heart rate zones or pace zones, and actually generally when I'm doing a structured workout I'll set a time or distance length, and I just want to know my average pace for that distance, and it's just not what their structured workout builder is set up for, so I find it annoyingly difficult to use it, and I tend to just use the manual lap instead. Also, a big note is there's no real proper track mode on this watch. There is a track and field sports mode, but this just uses the same kind of GPS as a general running mode. So, it might be handy to have different data fields set up ready to go, but you're not getting the kind of algorithms that you get on Garmin and Coros watches where they'll snap to the kind of track. So you get really good, accurate distance tracking on a track. And yeah, the distance tracking on a track with the Pacer Pro isn't very good because GPS struggles a bit if you keep running in circles like that.
So I mentioned it in battery life. You're obviously making a sacrifice here for those kind of recovery and sleep tracking features, those overnight kind of how well you've bounced back kind of readings, which I find on Polar are really quite good. They're really kind of useful. I do like the way the insights are kind of laid out and the information that you get, but you are going to have to make a trade-off. But I think it's a strong point on Polar's watches, the accuracy of some of those readouts, and just the detail and the level and the way that they present it, I think is pretty much kind of top-notch in terms of the sort of the running watch kind of world.
Sleep tracking is very good on the watch, like all Polar watches, and I found it pretty accurate. Actually, I found it a bit better than some of the other Polar watches in the past, and I think it might be because it's smaller and sits more snugly against the wrist, so it wasn't getting knocked around in the night if I changed position as much. And then also that all feeds into the suggested workouts each day. Those are pretty good. I think you can just follow those suggested workouts across the board and you'll get fitter, stronger, and they do really work. If you're fairly inexperienced, it's probably something I would suggest doing, but more, I guess, experienced runners and triathletes we might find them a little bit simplistic and might have more complex plans they'd use ahead of them. Fitness tests are a bit iffy for me still. Like the new walking one, I couldn't do it basically because I'd have a heart rate above 122 beats per minute during that test, which is 65% of my max. That's what it sets it as, but I can't get my heart rate that high via walking. That's kind of easy run heart rate really, so you're not allowed to run in that test. They explicitly forbid it, so I couldn't do that test. And the running test has failed for me in the past because it involves hitting a certain pace, quite a narrow band, and that rises over the course of the test, but that's relying on GPS reading the pace, so it just has always measured me going too fast or too slow outside that band and just failed before I managed to hit the requisite heart rate to get a fitness reading from the running test. So I'm not a huge fan of them. There's also just a lying down fitness test where you just relax for a few minutes and it spits out a VO2 max estimate, and that's a lot easier and a lot more fun. So I've done that one, but I haven't actually managed to complete the running or walking fitness test, unfortunately. What I will say is on the watch, it does kind of give you ongoing ratings of your fitness through things like the running index after each run and the kind of race times predictor, although those are incredibly optimistic. I say that now. It's got me down for a 1:05 half marathon and a 2:17 marathon, which is very flattering but utterly insane and actually of no real use in terms of gauging your target times. So no one's really nailed this yet. I think Coros is the best in terms of accuracy when it comes to predicted race times, and the Garmin's quite negative. Polar's very optimistic, but I would say you shouldn't really be using any of them to pick your target time. Smartwatch features are pretty weak on the watch. You know, it's designed to be a sports watch, but it's lagging behind, I suppose, competitors a little bit. Notifications also I turned off because the battery drains even quicker if you're getting those kind of vibrations on the notifications. So they're not that clear to read or easy to read either. Hard to access through the menus, and the music controls are fine, but yeah, it's clearly smart features are still not a huge focus for Polar.
I'm also a big fan of the FuelWise tool, which is now on here, and that basically gives you can sort of calculate how much fuel you need to cover a certain run at a certain intensity. It does update in real time and gives you reminders that you might need to eat if your intensity is higher than you expected. But I think by far the best thing is actually the calculator that you can do before you go out on a run, which will help you kind of get your head around what you need to put in your pocket to eat along the way, particularly if you're like me and sometimes you're going out and doing something that's an ultra. It's just a good, easy calculator that helps you sort of think, okay, I'm going to need that many carbs for this length of run.
So my verdict on the Polar Pacer Pro is, if you look at the price and the level of features that you're getting in return, I would say arguably it is probably Polar's best sports watch. And I think that's a key thing. You know, Polar's definitely pitches at runners, but it can track swims, you know, you can take it for HIIT training, you can go hiking with it. You know, it's got all those kind of sports profiles that you expect to get as well are here in place. You look at what you're getting from the Vantage V2 for less money. You know, you're still getting the turn-by-turn guidance. Via Commute, you're still getting FuelWise, FitSpark, Strava, live segments, all the kind of key things I would look for in a running watch. You know, you're only really missing out on kind of things like the orthostatic tests and the leg recovery test as well. And I think a few things around kind of navigation, but not things that I think are necessarily deal breakers. So for me, in terms of the level of features you're getting compared to the more expensive Polar watches and what you're getting below it, I think it's probably the best that you're going to get in terms of running. If you look at what else is around it, I think, you know, price-wise, you're looking at kind of the Garmin Forerunner 245, which I think the software feels a little bit nicer on the watch. I'm getting a little bit more in terms of smartwatch features and that overall experience. The battery life is about the same, you know, up to kind of 7 days. You're getting more GPS battery life here compared to the 245, so that's definitely a plus for the Pacer Pro. And then things like the Coros Apex, which you are getting more battery life, I think considerably more battery life kind of day to day. I don't think the watch is as nice looking as the Polar Pacer Pro ultimately. I think, you know, the level of training analysis is kind of there with it. I think kind of up there with the Polar Pacer Pro. As a package for £250, £260, $300, I think there's a lot of watch here that you're getting for your money. So yeah, kind of a solid watch for me, the Polar Pacer Pro. Step in the right direction, still some areas to improve, I think, for Polar, but overall, I think they've got a lot of things right on this watch.
For me then, like many of Polar's recent offerings, I think this is a very sort of solid watch without being particularly remarkable. You know, it does a good job. I was happy with it. I was kind of enjoyed using it. But the main thing for me, the USP here is probably the price point that it comes in when you look at the wide kind of feature set that it's got. It does have a lot in here. It has crammed quite a lot of Polar's kind of major features in here. There's not a lot that's missing. And for £259, you know, I think you're getting quite a lot of bang for your buck. The interesting thing is actually, if you don't care about Recovery Pro and you don't care about kind of having sort of a slightly more premium titanium finish, that this is actually really good competition for the Polar Vantage V2. I think, you know, to all intents and purposes, I think you're probably better off buying this one than the V2. You're getting kind of similar battery life performance. A lot of the features are here too. So yeah, that's one consideration. The other thing that I would kind of put it up against though is, you know, you get the Coros Pace 2, which is coming in, you know, much cheaper, £80 cheaper at about £179. You get a lot of similar features. I do think Polar's kind of training insights, recovery, all of that stuff is better, more accurate, more reliable than you get on the Coros. But if you're willing to kind of make a trade-off, you get those things tracked on the Coros. You know, if you don't really care too much about it and you just want a rough indication, then I think actually, you know, a big rival for this is still going to be that Coros Pace 2. And I think really, if budget is a main condition for you, then you're probably going to go Pace 2 would be a better option.
So I'd say the Polar Pacer Pro is a very good sports watch for its price, and I think it's the best watch in Polar's range. Maybe the cheaper Pacer might undercut it, but the upgrades to get the kind of navigation are quite important for me, and the barometric altimeter. So I'd say it's probably worth the 90 quid, especially if you get a nicer design with the aluminium bezel as well. But yeah, I think it's certainly better value than paying for the Vantage V2 or Gritex Pro. Like, I don't hugely love the size and look of those watches, and you know, the kind of extra features you get there are just a bit niche. I think things like the orthostatic tests and all that, like, they're not something I'm going to use. So I'm more than happy with the features on the Pacer Pro. So to get it a lot cheaper in a smaller, lighter watch, which I prefer the design of, I think makes it clearly the best polar watch for me in terms of balancing price and features. It's also very competitive against what is the main competition in this area from Coros and Garmin. You know, the Coros Pace 2 is a lot cheaper. That is one big problem this has. You know, that is a full triathlon watch for £180. It's also very small and light. It's got a really good battery life. It's now got pretty good training load analysis as well through Coros's Evo Lab stuff. I'd say the Polar's got a better app, and it's got better and more insightful training analysis through their kind of web and app platform. But actually the on-watch experience I think is a little bit better with the Coros Pace 2. And also there's the Coros Apex, which has navigation as well, and it comes in a little bit more expensive than the Pacer Pro, but again, you're getting a really big battery life there. And yeah, if you're not really diving into the app and the website a lot, Coros's watches do offer a slightly kind of easier experience on the wrist, I found. And then there's the Garmin Forerunner 245, which I think just has a better user experience all round. You obviously can get it with music as well, but yeah, Garmin's software and workout tracking and kind of structured workout builder and stuff like that, I think is all just a little bit slicker and easier to use and more enjoyable to use. And that I think is a big part generally of the problem Polar has with the Pacer Pro, is that, you know, it does a lot of stuff and it does it all pretty well, but it's not actually that great to interact with day to day. It's not, like I say, it's not a very good looking watch with that big black bezel. It's a bit awkward to use the buttons, the menus are not that well laid out, and the screen's not fantastic despite being brighter than other Polar watches. So although it is a good watch and it does kind of everything okay, it's still, you know, I still lean towards the Forerunner 245 myself, or go a fair bit cheaper and get the Pace 2, which does all the key stuff you want from a sports watch really well. It's obviously a big plus for the Pacer Pro that it is a full multi-sport watch, whereas the Forerunner 245 isn't. But you know, it's a running channel. I'm a runner. I can barely swim at all, so I'm not, that's not something I'm really looking for in this price range. But if you are, that is a nice plus point. Although obviously the Coros is cheaper and also a full multi-sport to watch as well. I hope to see Polar sharpen up their designs a fair bit. Maybe get a watch with a really nice sharp screen out in the sports watch realm. And I'd like to see them push forward a bit on the GPS accuracy front as well. Like, I am a bit obsessive about this stuff, and now that, you know, things like the Epics do exist that have really improved GPS accuracy with multiband and all systems on GPS modes, it's something that Polar's going to have to look at as well if they want to stay competitive, I think, in the future. So that's it, guys. That's our review of the Polar Pacer Pro. Let us know what you think in the comments. Is this the watch that's going to make you switch to Polar? Or if you are an existing Polar fan, is this the one you'll be going with ahead of the pricier options? Please like, subscribe, ring the little bell so you get notified when we release new videos. And yeah, we will see you next time.